Good evening and welcome to the Wednesday, October 9th, 2019 meeting of the East Lansing Planning Commission. Mr. Haywood, would you please call roll?
Chairperson Bowman.
Here.
Vice Chair Boyle.
Here.
Cahill. Downs. Sell.
Here.
Sullivan.
Here.
Watson.
Here.
Williams.
Here.
And Wolf.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you. You have in front of you an agenda for this evening's meeting. I would entertain a motion to approve that agenda.
So moved.
Second.
That's been moved by Commissioner Cahill and seconded by Vice Chair Boyle. Is there any discussion on that motion? Seeing none, we'll call for a vote. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. And those opposed? That motion carries. You also received in your packets a copy of the minutes of the September 25th, 2019 meeting. I would entertain a motion to approve those minutes.
So moved. Second.
That's been moved by Commissioner Cahill and seconded by Commissioner Wolf to approve those minutes. Is there any discussion on that motion? Seeing none, we'll call for a vote. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. And those opposed? That motion carries as well. Brings us on to committee reports, beginning with the Form-Based Code Committee. And I will start by reporting that we have not met since our last regular Planning Commission meeting, although we do have a meeting scheduled for this Friday, the 11th at 11 o'clock. And I'll remind everybody that we have two more work sessions currently scheduled, one for next Wednesday, the 16th, and then the two Wednesdays after that on October 30th. I will take questions from anybody, but I don't know that anything's changed. And so, well, seeing that we have no questions, I don't believe that the Hannah Community Center Study Committee has met, because you were done meeting and you were going to distribute some reports?
That's right. My understanding is it's going to be put on a City Council work session. The report is going to be put on a City Council work session that is going to be upcoming, and I think I've been told the date, but it doesn't spring quickly to my mind. 22nd?
I think it's the 22nd.
Okay, the 22nd. All right.
Of October.
Yep.
And also the Age-Friendly Communities Committee, which is not on the agenda, but I'm still a member of that committee. And I would like to report that the committee was in the process of developing an action plan which needed to be approved by the AARP and the World Health Organization, which are the bodies that run the Age-Friendly Community Program, and then adopted by City Council. The draft plan has been vetted by AARP, so we're in the process of getting ready to submit it to City Council.
Terrific. Any questions for Vice Chair Boyle about either of those two committees? All right, then we'll move on to staff. Whoops, was that a hand? Just putting your pen back in place. All right, thank you. Then we'll move on to staff reports. Mr. Haywood.
Yeah, just to give you a briefing of last night's meeting, City Council meeting. On their consent agenda, they approved a public hearing for November 12th for the Grove Street sorority site plan and special use permit. They also scheduled a public hearing for Ordinance 1469, which is the adult use marijuana ordinance, which we'll still be discussing tonight, and I will explain on our agenda item later as to why they chose to schedule a public hearing without having received a recommendation from the Planning Commission. They also approved or set a public hearing for November 12th for Ordinance 1468, which is the Grove Street rezoning for the sorority site. And then Ordinance 1462, they set a public hearing for, or they rescheduled a public hearing from October 29th to December 17th for the East Village ordinance amendments. Continuing on, I'm sorry, a question?
We're taking a pause, not a
Finish. Go ahead.
It's quite a meeting.
lengthy look.
Yes. Under their public hearings, there were several of those. The motion to approve the Park Place West development at 314, 328, 334, and 340 to 344 Evergreen failed, so that development was denied, largely for the same reasons that the Planning Commission's recommendation held. The River Street sorority at 215, 217, was approved with some conditions, some modifications to the porch on the front, and some minor modifications to the building, but otherwise it was approved. They also approved a site plan and special use permit for 218 Albert Avenue, which is for the Jolly Pumpkin restaurant with alcohol sales. They also approved a special use permit for alcohol sales at the Target store at 201 East Grand River. And finally, under their public hearings, they approved the development at 6210 Abbott for the two-bedroom units at the rear of the Gaslight Village, and also approved removing the 2-year lease restriction. Under their business agenda, there was a request to make a modification to the Merritt Road, 1950 Merritt Road Medical Marijuana Provisioning Center. They had come in with a administrative approval request to make minor modifications to the building facade, which staff was generally okay with, except that they proposed to expand the use, move much of the ancillary uses like their office, their storage, their safe, their bud room, and some other ancillary uses to the basement, which wasn't the original application, which nearly doubled their square footage of the building, of the use, and nearly doubled their retail floor area. Otherwise, all of the conditions of approval would still be met. They still had enough parking. It really didn't change the functionality of the site at all, and they're headed in the right direction for site plan compliance, so council approved that. Lastly, council did not introduce Ordinance 1473, which was a request for a conditional rezoning at 1108 East Grand River Avenue, which was really an attempt to reduce the 1,000-foot separation requirement for medical marijuana facilities. It was an improper, they deemed it an improper request. It was really a request to amend the text of the ordinance and not a conditional rezoning, so they did not introduce that, and advised the applicant if they wanted to pursue a text amendment, the appropriate way would be to ask for a text amendment. And we'll see if they do that and where that goes.
That's the former party store.
Yeah, that's the former Odie's Big Ten Party store. That completes my report.
Questions for Mr. Hayward? Commissioner Wolf?
Not a question, but an addition. I was pleased to see what council did with the parking at the Gaslight Village. If you remember, they had an excess of parking. I can't remember the numbers exactly, but it was well above what's considered the normal maximum because they wanted to put as much as they could back in the new housing, left them with an excess up front. And council put in a condition that they have to remove 32 spaces worth of asphalt in front and convert it to landscaping. Rather than, their other option was to give them a waiver to have more parking than the maximum that's normally allowed, and they chose to tell them to remove it.
Any questions for Mr. Haywood or other comments? All right, then that'll move us on to commissioner announcements. And then right on to communications from citizens. This is the time in our meeting when we invite members of the public to come forward and make a comment on any item that is on our agenda or is not on our agenda. We generally ask that if you would like to make comments on public hearings, of which we have one regarding a property at 3225 West Road, you hold on to your comments until that item is actually on our agenda. And we do have a matter regarding adult use marijuana establishments as part of old business, for which we will not be taking public comment, but you're welcome to approach the mic now if you'd like to make comments on that item or any other item that you would like to make your views known to the Planning Commission. I'm seeing no one come forward, so we'll move on to public hearings. We have, well, we sort of have one. This is Ordinance 1470. A public hearing will be held to consider Ordinance 1470, an ordinance to rezone the property located at 3225 West Road from RA Residential Agricultural District to B2 Retail Sales Business District. And I don't see Mr. Parcell.
No, I can handle that.
All right, Mr. Hayward.
Normally we would cover this request as per our staff report, et cetera. However, we've received communication from the applicant that they wish to withdraw their rezoning request. Apparently, they feel that the more appropriate district to pursue in their mind is B4, and will be resubmitting for a request to rezone to B4 at a later time. So with that, staff would recommend that you move to accept the withdrawal. And
So moved.
Support. It's been moved by Commissioner Sullins and seconded by Commissioner Cahill. Is there discussion on that motion? Commissioner Wolf?
This isn't really about the motion. I wanted to have some discussion first before we had a motion. I guess I could bring this up during commissioner concerns at the end if it's not appropriate now.
If you don't think that has anything to do with the motion?
Not the motion to defer or whatever it is we're doing, no.
To accept the withdrawal.
It's about the issues involved. I wasn't here for the September 11th meeting when this was discussed, and there was an issue that did not come up that I wanted to raise tonight. So if no one cares, I could go ahead and bring it up right now.
Yeah, I don't see that should be a problem. That's
It'll
fine.
take a few minutes.
That's fine, carry on.
I'm raising it for staff. It's partly a question to staff, not necessarily to be answered tonight, but a question of whether you had considered a related issue, and if not, you could look into it as this goes forward. And the issue is that we have another property in the city that is in almost exactly this same situation with a lot split and a special use permit and a lack of frontage. It's the hotel that's on Trowbridge Road. Have you looked into that or the comparison between the two? Or is that not? I'll go over it really quickly. So in 2017, they came in with an application for 1100 Trowbridge Road to build a hotel at the back of the property and a small retail building in the front. And it required special use permits for at least the 4-story hotel and the drive-through on the retail building. There might have been something else, but there was at least those two. That went through the process. City Council approved it. And then that summer, they came back with another request to split the lots. And that came to us. The split is almost identical to what's being done on West Road, where now the hotel is left at the back of the property, has no frontage on the road. They have an easement to get through, the same as the property on West Road would be, but they don't have the frontage. At that time, when they split the lot, the issue was never raised as to whether that would have an effect on the special use permit. Staff didn't mention it, none of us thought of it. So we recommended approval, City Council approved it. Then, to even after that, let me see if I can find the right one here. Yeah, in April of this year, the hotel came back to us asking for an additional special use permit, or well, I guess it's a revision of the special use permit, to sell alcohol in their sundry store. And again, at that time, it didn't come up. Well, I shouldn't say that. The issue was addressed in the staff report at that time. As the staff report normally does for a special use permit, they list the code requirement for it. It says for a special use permit, the proposed use shall be located with direct access to and frontage on a major street as designated in the major street plan. And the staff comment on it was, the overall property has frontage on Trowbridge Road, which is designated as a major street. And I don't recall anyone here ever questioning that. You know, we accepted that as being the justification for it, and we recommended approval, and they got that modification. So my question is, does that same logic apply to this property? That you could say the same thing about the West Road property, that the overall property that's asking for the special use permit, you know, the overall project has the frontage.
So yeah, I think that did come up in discussion, and we consulted with the city attorney about our interpretation of that at the time, and he disagreed, and that this couldn't be that had he known about that then, his answer would have been the same.
Would have been that it does not have frontage?
Correct.
So the issue would have come up when the lot split came forward?
Potentially, yeah.
I mean, that's the point
We
where-
we didn't examine that in detail
Right.
together.
Up until the lot split, it was okay, so,
Yeah.
all right,
So we can continue to revisit that.
all right.
And
I wasn't
have
sure
that
what the answer would be, I
discussion-
just knew it
Have
was
that
very
discussion relative to
similar.
that property and see where it goes from there.
I believe, though, that the hotel property, I could be wrong about this, but I think both the hotel and the commercial property have a single owner. So, to me, that's like, my home sits on 2.5 lots in the city, but I'm a single owner of the 2.5 lots. Now, if in fact, then they sold the commercial property as opposed to renting it, or they sold the hotel as opposed to being in some sort of development agreement with it, that might make a difference. But if a single owner owns 2 adjacent lots, only one of which has frontage and access, I don't see how that's a problem. I mean, that's just talking, I think that's different than if you had 2 separate owners of the 2 lots.
Commissioner Wolf? Then-
Yeah, what I recall from the time was they specifically said they were changing the ownership for the hotel. That was why they wanted to split it, because they had another LLC or something. I don't know if it was actually a totally distinct
Yeah.
owner, but it was a legally distinct entity. That was why they were doing it. And then on West Road, at this point, we don't have any indication that those are under different ownership, do we? They're doing it as one property and splitting it, so. Yes, here. Okay.
Commissioner Cahill?
I was just going to say, I don't think it matters if both lots are owned by the same person, because tomorrow that can change. And then that puts in this case, it would be the hotel
Right.
would be out of compliance.
Well, then I guess the other question is, do you deny a lot split after you've given the special use permit? Is that a reason to deny a lot split? I don't know, that's just a question.
that's-
I don't know
that's a
the
tricky
answer to
question,
that.
right.
I don't know the answer to that, but once they already have the special use permit, they might be all right, so. That's an interesting piece of property anyway,
Yes, it
because the only access it has is a shared driveway
Right.
that isn't there.
Both of those lots rely on an easement through the property next to them.
Exactly.
To have
You're
access.
using-
But the front
using-
one does have frontage.
Yes.
Clearly has frontage.
Yes, but neither really has access without the shared driveway, nor could they ever have access because of the location of the property in conjunction with where the ramp begins, so.
Thank you for that.
So that was my comment about that.
Good. Any other discussion on the motion? Okay, right now we have a motion from Commissioner Sell and seconded by Commissioner Cahill to accept the applicant's withdrawal to a later date, or of this particular application. We'll expect to see it at a later date. Is there any further discussion? Then all those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. And those opposed? That motion carries. Moves us on to item 7B, 7A. This is old business. This is ordinance 1469. A public hearing will be held to consider ordinance 1469, an ordinance to allow for and regulate adult use marijuana establishments. Mr. Haywood.
I shouldn't say public hearing, okay. So, yes, so this is just an update from, I think you guys met and discussed this on the 25th. I was not here, but I did review the video and talk to Ms. Schmidt about the proceedings, and apparently there were 2 main questions about how the ordinance was drafted. One being, what's the extra cost associated with requiring an applicant to have both medical and recreational licenses? And what was the intent of only having a recreational license allowed where medical licenses were already approved? So first, with regard to fees for licensing, medical marijuana provisioning centers have an application fee at the state level of $6,000, but no associated licensing fee. An adult use marijuana retailer application fee is similarly $6,000, and the licensing fee is $25,000. So there'd be considerable fees in terms of establishing the use there. In addition to that, the city of East Lansing would require a $5,000 application fee and then an annual fee of $5,000 on top of that for both provisioning center and adult use retailer. And then each would also be required to contribute the 1% of their net profit accordingly. So that kind of gives you a rundown of the licensing. So before I guess we react to that, I'd like to go into the second question as well and talk about why the ordinance was structured the way it is. And it's really two-part. I think I answered one of the parts here, and I've since found a little bit more information about why it was structured the way it was. The first reason is that the MRTA, the Act, has a loophole or a backdoor in it that allows marijuana retailers to locate at the same site as a medical marijuana provisioning center if a medical marijuana provisioning center has already been licensed. The Act allows them to have a retailer there if the city opts in. If we opt in, we cannot prevent that from happening. The second part is, which I don't have in the staff report, but which I found in the emergency rules established by the Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs, that states, and which I think is the real reason why the ordinance is written the way it is, that an applicant is ineligible to receive a state license if any of the following circumstances exist. The applicant does not hold a state operating license pursuant to the Medical Marijuana Facilities Licensing Act, and is applying for a marijuana retailer. So they have to, by the Act, they have to be a medical marijuana retailer already. And that's for the first 2 years of the, once they start accepting applications. So the Act already contemplates that they will be there. And I think that's tied to the Act and such. And so they're saying for the first 2 years, they're going to allow that automatically. So given that, and given council's preferences and the way the ordinance was already structured, rather than allowing additional locations, staff thought that this was the appropriate way. In fact, I think it was drafted by the city attorney that this was the most appropriate way to start the ordinance and have that discussion, given all of those knowns. So that hopefully kind of helps answer the fee questions. We're kind of, if we opt in, we kind of have to allow for that, and that those would be the fees.
Yeah, that was in the update that you pointed us to as well.
Great.
I found it said exactly what you just said. The new recreational marijuana law requires that businesses with marijuana licenses be the first to get recreational marijuana licenses for the first 2 years after licensing begins. Otherwise, new administrative backlogs would be likely. So that's a sort of a common sense and a sort of a legal.
And then just to take it a step further before you get too far into discussion, the reason that the city council is setting a public hearing for the 29th before the planning commission has given a referral is that the state will start receiving applications on November 1st, and similarly, I'll go back to that page. The state is required to issue a license if the applicant has been deemed to qualify for a license within 10 days of that determination. So, you know, if their intent is to process these quicker, it's quite likely we could have a licensing issued by the state without much of our involvement, and very quickly after the November 1st. I think that's their intent, is to, with the retailer, expedite that process. So that we're not in the position of having no regulation in place, which would automatically opt us in, licenses be issued. We are now faced with approved licensed facility locations and no regulatory framework in place. So that's why the expediency for setting the public hearing for the 29th by council was approved last night. So with that, I would take any questions or comments.
Questions for Mr. Haywood? Commissioner Wolf?
I had found that restriction in the emergency rules as well, and considered this issue, and I still have at least two problems with us having that requirement in our ordinance. And the first one is that for us to put that requirement in our ordinance is redundant, because if an applicant goes to the state, an applicant who does not have a medical marijuana license, if they go to the state and request a marijuana retailer, it's what we're calling it, license, the state will turn them down, right? The state emergency rule says they cannot get one if they don't already have the...
In the first 2 years. But
Yes,
after
right.
that period, if we don't adjust our ordinance, then it would be...
Right. So our ordinance will essentially have no effect. Even if we didn't put that in there, they couldn't come to us with a state approval and say, I want to open a marijuana retailer locally. The second problem with it is that after December 6th, 2021, the state apparently will no longer apply that restriction. So after that time, an applicant could come to them and apply for a marijuana retailer license without having a provisioning center license. At that time, then, if an applicant got the state license and came to us, our law would be saying, sorry, you can't do that. So our ordinance would then be in conflict with the state law, would it not? And that's what we've already been told by our attorney. We can't put restrictions on it that are, that are not allowed by the state. So it seems to me as though we would then have to change ours.
Could a sunset provision be placed in our ordinance that would, sorry, maybe I'm...
I just don't see any reason, if the emergency regulations require them for the first 2 years to already have a provisioning license, is that the correct, medical marijuana license, then I don't see why we would need to put it in our ordinance. I don't understand why it's in our ordinance unless we want that to apply even if the emergency rules are modified or somehow sunset. And I don't see a reason to have it apply if it's no longer in the rules, the state rules. It just doesn't make sense to me. It's like a sore thumb in the ordinance.
I agree, and I had one more point to make, if I can.
Just a second. Did you have response?
No,
Okay.
go ahead.
Thanks.
The third point was that even if the state has this restriction in the state rules, let's suppose we pass this ordinance, or city council passes it as written, a new applicant could still come in, find a property, in theory, find a property somewhere in the city, apply for a medical marijuana provisioning center license, go through all the proper paperwork and everything, get approved, come back, apply for a marijuana retailer license, and get that approved. They would be going through all of the requirements. It would just make it longer for them, more work for us. It wouldn't reduce the number of potential locations at all. That's going to be restricted by what what properties can be found within the overlays. So I can't see, again, I'm arguing even further that it's redundant. It's not going to prevent anyone from becoming a marijuana retailer. It just makes them do more paperwork.
And pay more fees.
Yes.
Commissioner Williams, all right, did you let me know if at any point you want to respond first, please?
I agree with the concerns that have been raised so far, but I wanted to raise one additional issue, and it has to do with social equity. Under the act that legalized recreational marijuana, the state was required to create a plan to assist communities that have been disproportionately affected by marijuana prohibition. And LARA has created this social equity program targeted to 19 Michigan communities with above average rates of marijuana arrests and high poverty rates. East Lansing is one of those, but yet neither the background materials we're considering tonight nor the ordinance has any reference to that program or in any way encourages applicants who may be eligible to participate in that program. The LARA program is designed to increase the number of business owners in those localities in the marijuana industry that's clearly growing. For example, applicants can apply for discounts in licensing and application fees with the state. There are several communities that are in that list of 19 that are having pretty robust community conversations about creating local social equity programs. The executive director of the Marijuana Regulatory Agency stated that the state's goal is to have 50% of the adult use licensees in these 19 communities be held by participants in the social equity program. But again, we haven't really had those conversations. Not only that, but the requirement that we're talking about here, that you have to hold a medical marijuana license in order to receive a recreational license, may very well foreclose the opportunity to get such a license by somebody who's eligible for that social equity program. So I think that's a really serious issue that should be part of this conversation.
Thank you. Commissioner Wolf.
Just want to say that that issue did come up at the city council meeting last night. It was brought up by Jeffrey Hank, and the mayor, if I remember correctly, asked for more information from staff about that, and was going to get a report about why East Lansing qualified and perhaps about what they could do. And I agree. It is disappointing that it was not covered in this. I can sort of see the problem being that we have this deadline where we have to get an ordinance in place by November 1st, and the whole social equity issue is pretty complicated. It's not at all obvious to me what should be done about it or what can be done. So I can see why it's hard to get it into the ordinance, but I think it should be a priority to, even if this has to be passed in its current form, to get something in place as quickly as we can.
Well, I don't think it's necessary to have that program detailed in the ordinance initially, and the time frame is a significant issue. But there are things in the current draft that I think make having such an equity program be successful are impediments to that being the case. And there are some things that could be done, even, for example, the fee that's paid. There are several charitable opportunities to have that fee diverted to. I see none of those. That, although all of them are certainly supportable and good initiatives, I don't see any of them necessarily that support the rationale for which the social equity program was created, and they certainly could have expanded that to reflect those considerations. That wouldn't be very difficult or time-consuming to do.
Thank you. Other comments?
So my question was going to be, so if after December 6, 2021, if we don't have something in the ordinance that addresses social equity, or where a recommendation for where retailer locations should be, then it is somewhat unregulated in terms of the location at that point.
No. The ordinance is written so that the marijuana retailers are only allowed in the existing overlay district. That's the only place they're listed as a permitted use.
So it would be just the similar, it would be a parallel system, so there would be, for example.
I mean, that's the way it's written, yeah.
But, for example, like on East Grand River Avenue, there would be potentially two separate sites. The separation distance wouldn't apply to a retailer and a provisioning center. They could be next to each other, they could be 200 feet
I
apart, they
don't
could
think
be.
that's the way it's written.
No, I'm saying there could be one of each of those in that district.
No, I don't think the way it's written that would be possible. I'd have to look at the exact language that's in there, but I don't think so.
If I could. The distances in section 50-94A. That's where the 1,000-foot separation appears. And the additional standards for marijuana establishments specifically references that section. So I read that to mean that the 1,000-foot separation applies both to medical marijuana and recreational marijuana. And I certainly think that was the intent of City Council, was to have the 1,000-foot separation. I mean, I think there are some challenges to social equity from the fact that the overlay so limits the number of possible marijuana retailing, whether it be medical or recreational establishments. So that's going to be a challenge once we get all the medical ones where there was no consideration of social equity up and running, because we have such a limitation on the number of spots that are available. But I don't know, is that something for us to address right now when we're looking at this ordinance under what are significant time limitations. But speaking for myself, I would prefer any recommendation from the Planning Commission to City Council to specifically recommend that they strike the requirement that recreational marijuana retailers already have a valid medical marijuana license, and further that council consider in the future adoption of language to address the social equity concerns that are set forth in the statute. But I don't think that has to be done before this looming deadline for us to have an ordinance in place. That part doesn't have to, but I would like any recommendation to council to specifically recommend that they strike that requirement, which I don't know what section it's in, but.
Yeah, I was prepared to move an amendment once we get to that.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure we amend ordinances. It's not like
You can recommend changes.
Yeah,
Well,
we have, certainly have before.
Yeah.
I would support that.
Other discussion? Commissioner Cahill.
One, it's kind of a technical point, but if we look at the definition of marijuana establishment, which is on, well, what's that under? It's in the definitions.
Page 3.
Be the third page, yeah. It lists a number of things that are marijuana establishments, and then it concludes by adding on, or any other type of marijuana-related business. Well, I guess I withdraw the thought I had there. I guess it is clear enough. Sorry.
No worries, thank you. Other discussion? Commissioner Cahill.
The other one would be in 50-94B, subsection B1, which is at the top of the page, third page, says the establishment shall not cause or continue an undue concentration of similar uses in the neighborhood such that medical marijuana provisioning center facilities and paraphernalia trade become a dominant influence or feature of the district or neighborhood. I would be proposing to strike that when we address that, for the reason that it's vague and it's stating something that the licensee can't possibly control. The licensee to have a building, the licensee can't say, well, you can't build next to me, or you can't open a business over here, or that type of thing. So for that reason, plus I think you have difficulty deciding what an undue concentration is. And this has come up with other ordinances we've had before us. So I would be proposing that we strike that once we address this.
Commissioner Wolf?
Two comments on that. First, since you bring it up, I noticed there's really an error there. It should not say medical marijuana provisioning center there. It should say marijuana retailer, because this whole portion is for the new types of establishments. Or maybe it should say marijuana establishments in general. It should not say medical
It's actually
marijuana
both,
anyway.
isn't it? Yep.
And second, I think it's not an issue of, I think what it's trying to say is the establishment shall not be approved for its special use permit if the council believes that adding it, building it, opening it, whatever, would cause an undue concentration of uses in the neighborhood. So that's something that they could decide at that point. It's not something that, it's not talking about what might happen after they open. I don't know if that makes it any more acceptable to you. It is still a bit vague, but we have had that kind of language in some other parts. At one time, we had it about alcohol sales establishments. And it was something that was always evaluated at the time they apply for it. Are there already too many of them there? It's not whether someone locates next to them later on, if that helps.
Of course, in this case, unlike the alcohol limitation provision, there's already a distance or a zone, whatever, that would almost by
For the sales
definition.
themselves.
Exactly. Limit the undue concentration, theoretically. Vice Chair Boyle?
Yeah, well, actually, looking again at the current ordinance, Section A, which is the 1,000-foot separation, specifically speaks to medical marijuana. So if, in fact, what they want is a 1,000-foot separation to continue between any medical or recreational retailer, then they need to change the part of Section A, 94A.
Where is that? I was trying to look.
It's
for
not
it.
there,
in the
you
staff
have to
report.
get it out of
So
the
it's not
ordinances.
in the part that's being revised?
That's right.
Okay,
That's
why I
right,
couldn't
it's in the
find it.
ordinances. So they would need to revise that to say medical or recreational marijuana in Part A, and then if they do that, perhaps echo it in Part B, parens 1. And instead of saying an undue concentration, if you want to use the 1,000-foot separation, they might as well use it both places. Because undue concentration has been problematic to apply with alcohol, and it will certainly be no less problematic to apply with marijuana.
Absolutely. Commissioner Sell?
I have a vague recollection that we had the very same conversation about the medical marijuana, but I could be wrong. Didn't we come down on the side of the idea that the 1,000-foot buffer was automatically going to prevent an undue concentration? So, I mean, I think the city should stick with the original concept and make it consistent.
It's sort of doubly limited, right? Because there's zones in which these can occur, and then, you know, you could do, if you're 1,000 feet away but not within a zone, then it doesn't apply.
Takes care of itself.
Commissioner Wolf?
Yeah, just in counterpoint, I'll point out
there we go.
that it does say in this thing about undue concentration, it refers to medical marijuana provisioning center facilities and paraphernalia trade, which is not affected by the 1,000-foot buffer. So there could be those type of businesses open in the area. It does address at least one little thing that the 1,000-foot or 500-foot separation does not.
Stick that in your pipe.
Vice Chair Boyle?
Well, the other thing, and I think this is just a discussion that doesn't really relate to the ordinance, is I think we're anticipating that if you have a medical marijuana provisioning license and you can get a recreational marijuana provisioning license, that you're going to want to get that and run your business as recreational marijuana. Otherwise, are you running two separate businesses out of the same location, one of which demands a card and whatever record keeping you have to do when you're requiring a person with a medical marijuana card to purchase marijuana, and at the same time you're operating a business that can sell retail to anyone over the age of 21 who doesn't have a card? Are you going to surrender your medical marijuana license, or are you going to pay 1% on your all sales to the medical marijuana and 1% on all your sales to the recreational marijuana, so you're paying 2% per year? And we don't know what's going to happen with those existing licenses, but I'm not, maybe Mr. Hanks knows, I'm not sure what a business owner is going to do. Why would you use all the restrictions that come with medical marijuana if you can just sell it to everyone over 21? I would think most of these licenses, once they go through the state, are gonna change to recreational marijuana provisioning centers.
With the understanding, presumably, that anybody that has a card will no longer need it in order to get
Right,
in the, you know,
right.
so it's,
They'd be able, as long as they're 21,
Yeah.
yes, they'd be able to purchase it.
Commissioner
I
Self.
think there's a potency difference, and that they are, under the law, considered two different products. And
Well, that may be true, I don't know. But still, how are you gonna run two businesses? Are you gonna,
The door.
well, I don't know, it's a good question. Does that mean that if, somebody 21 comes into my licensed establishment, I can't give them this potency unless they have a card? Are we gonna run it that way?
I don't know whether most of the time they're having to be physically separate or not. I don't have any expertise about that. But I definitely recall, as it floated out there, what would be the advantage or disadvantage to having a card or not having a card, or as a proprietor doing retail versus medical. It had to do with a potency difference where, if I recall, medical marijuana is generally cultivated for a higher potency, and the recreational supposedly at a lower potency. I'm no marijuana expert, but
Well, I just wonder, is that under the statute, though?
I think so.
Commissioner Wolf?
Yeah, I was going to say, I've read through the emergency rules for both of them and don't remember anything about a potency difference. I'm not an expert and I could have missed it, but I did not see that. I will say that the rules, the new emergency rules for marijuana retailers do specifically say that if they are running both a provisioning center and a retailer at the same location, they have to keep everything separate. They have to keep the inventory separate, they have to keep the records separate. It has to be two very distinct businesses. And they are actually, at the moment, they are allowed to sell marijuana from a provisioning center business to a retailer business, but not vice versa. And if I understand it, the reason they're allowed to do that is because they're expecting a shortage of retailer marijuana growing to start with. There may not be enough to supply the marijuana retailers as they open. So they're allowing it to come over from the medical marijuana market. But they are still requiring to keep records of what they sold and keep the businesses separate. So I'm with Kathy. I can't see why a business would want to deal with that. If they can get a recreational marijuana license, they shouldn't lose any customers. Why not just operate that?
So I just kind of want to go back and try to understand where you're headed with it. If you don't have the requirement to co-locate and we opt in, the state will allow it anyway, right?
Require it.
I mean,
Sure.
it's going to happen in the
Oh,
first
yes, it'll be
year.
allowed. We're just saying don't require it.
Okay, so I guess my point is after that, if we don't require it, we still have the separation requirement, but not the requirement to co-locate. What's the effect of the opportunity for a new location after that?
It doesn't really have any effect, does it?
I think that's my point, is that there wouldn't be an opportunity for a new location because those establishments are going to be there and stay there most likely for quite some time.
Right, unless somebody can find a lot somewhere
Yeah.
that meets the
But-
requirements. That'll be true from
But it-
now on forward.
right, but-
Regardless of what we do.
Right, so there likely will only ever be about five locations, right?
I don't expect that to be true for the extended future, no. It will depend on city council, but
Sure, I mean, unless the ordinance is changed to
Right.
allow for more locations.
Right.
Right.
Well, I suppose it's possible that somebody might go out of their medical marijuana business, so there's a location that is outside the 1,000 feet limitation, but in the overlay district, and then they would not have to go get a medical marijuana license first before they can have retail marijuana. So I think that requirement, since it's in the statute, or excuse me, in the emergency rules, I just don't see the purpose of having it in the ordinance, and I see it as a potential complication for the social equity portion of the licensing. That's my feeling about that.
And I understand that. I get where you're coming from on that. So my follow-up question is, if that happens and you don't tie the two together, because then you don't tie the separation distance together, you then could have two within 1,000?
No.
I'm sure council intends that separation distance, which we keep referring to 1,000 feet. It's actually 500 throughout most of the
Well,
overlay. It's
but
1,000 in only one of them.
But I bring
anyway.
up, but I bring up that example because in that district, it's generally going to limit it to one, most likely in most cases. So the effect is a little bit greater, I think, there for an additional one.
Right, but still, I would expect that in passing this, that council would clean up that distance so that it applies to both of them. I'm not sure we
Yeah,
could do
I
it
just-
tonight,
Yeah.
and not
Right.
having that as part of what's in front of us, but it might not be hard since you found that section already.
Yeah, it would be easy. They just need to say a medical marijuana dispensary or
A marijuana retailer.
a marijuana
is the
retailer. Yes.
proper name for
Yes,
the
they
other
need
one.
the distance, and they say to a dispensary or a retailer. And then they'll have whatever distance they thought was important to have in the overlays. And they might end up then with a location where there's one medical marijuana dispensary and one retailer, and they're as far apart as they wanted them to be instead of having two dispensaries. They might end up with that. But certainly that won't be contrary to what council's goals were when they did the overlay and imposed those distance requirements.
The state licenses don't expire in any way, do they? I
don't believe they expire. I think you have to
Okay, so
renew
if-
them every year.
If one of these businesses got their marijuana retailer license, in the next year or so, on top of their provisioning center license, and then they operated for whatever length of time and realized there's no point in us selling medical marijuana. We don't want to run the two businesses. We want to be just a retailer. They would still retain their medical marijuana license. It wouldn't be taken away, I assume. But the business would change to be just a retailer, is what I can envision actually happening.
Well, I thought
So-
there's a fee every year. Isn't there a fee every year?
So they would,
There's a fee by the city for the special use permit and the state licensing.
so we're going to charge them a double fee if they have both licenses. So that, to me, that would be another reason to take this requirement out, because if they decided they no longer wanted to be in the medical marijuana business, they should be able to drop that license and no longer pay for that every year. Otherwise, if we have the requirement in there, they're going to have to pay for both of them.
Yeah, I agree with that. Is it not the case, though, that one, I don't disagree, that once the recreational license is issued, the medical license could be dropped? It was basically that they had to get it, they were first in line, but that doesn't mean that, as I understand it, that it would have to be maintained, right? That you have to have it to start.
I don't think that's what it says.
I think
It
it
says,
says-
they're ineligible. Well, an applicant is ineligible to receive a state license if, and that's the retailer,
Right.
the recreational.
Right.
If the applicant does not hold a state operating license for medical marijuana.
You
So I
still
guess
get
you could
double
read
hit the
that,
first time around.
that it means at the point they're receiving it. Once they have it, they can keep it. It could be.
Again, I'm not taking that up as a reason to not
Right.
recommend it be removed. Commissioner Cahill?
That sounds like you could have a medical marijuana license for one location, but you wouldn't necessarily need to have it for your other locations. You just have to have one somewhere.
I wondered about that. I don't know. Whether it's a locale, is your license for a location? Or do you have a license in the business's name?
It is.
Under the
I'm sure.
state,
The li-
under the state law?
The license from the state is always for a location, I'm pretty sure. You have to tell the location.
Okay.
This requirement here does not say the applicant does not hold a state operating license for that location. It does almost sound as though, I don't know if that's what they intended, that
I'm not sure that's what they intended.
if someone could get a retailer license based on a medical license at a different location. Not too clear.
Any other discussion? I guess a motion would be in order.
I saw
Commissioner
potential there.
Commissioner Sullivan, oh, sorry.
So in 5094B, subsection A1 makes reference to
Okay,
the
wait a
Mich-
minute. Where are we? What page or something?
50, I don't know if
Don't
there's not
have
really a
page
page number on here, but
Okay,
5094B,
Okay,
subsection A1,
A1.
about the fourth line down,
Got it.
makes reference to the Michigan Department of Community Health. In 2015, the governor merged the Michigan Department of Community Health with the Michigan Department of Human Services, creating the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. So I believe this is a non-existent state department.
Thank you.
It's good to have someone from the
Exactly.
legislature here.
You just earned your pay. Well done.
Boy, makes you wonder how many things, makes you wonder how many things we might have elsewhere in our ordinances, because, I mean, that kind of thing has happened multiple times where agencies have been renamed.
Yeah.
I think Lara.
Yeah, and Cindy brought up a good point too, or Commissioner Williams, sorry. The actual act, when they reference department, they don't even reference Department of Health and Human Services. The actual definition of department in the act is LARA, so.
Commissioner Cahill?
Is there a Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs now? Lara?
Yes.
Oh, that's it, okay.
Uh-huh.
If there's no further discussion, then I'll repeat that a motion would be in order so that we can at least talk about how to make modifications that we've now discussed, or recommend modifications. Commissioner Wolf.
I don't see a motion in here, but I'll move that we recommend approval of ordinance 1469 as included in our packet for our October 9th meeting, an ordinance to allow for and regulate adult use marijuana establishments.
Is there a second?
Support.
It's been moved by Commissioner Wolf and seconded by Commissioner Cahill. Is there any discussion on that motion?
I'd like to offer an amendment.
Please?
All right, I would like to move that we strike section B6 from the ordinance. That section reads, "The marijuana retailers must have been issued a special use permit for a medical marijuana provisioning center facility and have an equivalent license issued by the state as defined by the administrative rules for the Michigan Regulation and Taxation of Marijuana Act for the same." That appears on the unnumbered page.
That's page 7.
It's section 50-94B, parens B, parens 6, close parentheses.
Yep.
Support.
It's been moved by Vice Chair Boyle and seconded by Commissioner Williams. Is there discussion on that amendment?
Well, I think we've discussed it enough so
have.
that we all understand our rationale for striking that section.
Yes. Any other discussion? All those in favor of the amendment, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
And those opposed? The amendment passes. Further discussion, Commissioner Wolf?
Another amendment at the very, basically doing the same thing, at the very end of the ordinance, the very last sentence in effect. It's on section 50-803, permitted uses, parent B. It reads marijuana retail, let's see, it's a list of uses, permitted uses. Marijuana retailers, if they meet the standards of and are operated in accordance with the standards set forth in 50-94A and section 50-94B, A, and B. And I would modify it to end it after that B that I just read, because it continues by saying, and have been issued a special use permit for a medical marijuana provisioning center at the same location, et cetera. It's basically the same language we just struck in the other part.
Support.
Just a moment, please. It's been moved by Commissioner Wolf and seconded by Commissioner Williams. Any discussion on that motion? All those in favor of the motion, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
And those opposed? That motion carries. That brings us back to the main motion. Commissioner Cahill, excuse me.
As I indicated before, I would move to strike in the same section Commissioner Boyle addressed, parens 1, which states that the establishment should not cause or continue an undue concentration of similar uses in the neighborhood, such that medical marijuana provisioning center facilities and paraphernalia trade become a dominant influence or feature in the district or neighborhood. I think that's too vague. Much of it an undue concentration is in the eye of the beholder. Many people think any marijuana would be an undue concentration.
Before
But
we-
also,
Before we get too far, I'll second it for discussion.
oh, sorry.
Thank you. Is there any discussion on
you.
the motion?
Yeah.
Mr. Cahill.
I'll reincorporate what I said, or incorporate what I just said. And as I said, I think it's unfair to, because it says, I understand what Commissioner Wolf was saying about maybe this is for just when it's being issued, but it does say shall not cause. And giving a license there could cause related businesses to spring up around it, which would be outside the control of the licensee. So for the reason that I think it's vague and puts conditions that are not under the control of the licensee, I would move that we strike it.
Other discussion on that amendment? Commissioner Wolf?
I believe I'll vote in favor of this, but I do want to point out that I'm pretty certain that we have this exact same clause in the medical marijuana. Well, in fact, you can see it was copied from there. It says medical marijuana provisioning centers. So, City Council already approved it for that. Even if we change this, it will still be in the ordinance for the medical marijuana provisioning centers.
I know it was in the draft anyway for medical marijuana,
Well,
but I thought we might have stricken it from that.
I think, well, I don't know, I'm pretty sure the city attorney copied all of this from the medical marijuana portion, and that's why it even still has that reference to medical marijuana provisioning centers, but.
It's there.
Yeah, thank you.
It's in section 94B, just a minute, 94A, 94A, and then there's, under the A, there's a paragraph B, and it's 1.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
it's in
it's right
exactly the
there.
same spot.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's not necessarily a reason to not do it, but we're still going to have that language in a different spot for a different type of establishment.
Any other discussion on that motion, that amendment, excuse me? All those in favor of the amendment, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
And those opposed? Again, that brings us back to the main motion made by Commissioner Wolf and seconded by Commissioner Cahill. Commissioner Wolf?
Do we need to do anything about that Department of Community Health reference? Rules of the Michigan Department of Community Health. It seems like the thing to do would be to strike it rather than to try to change it to a different, especially if the state
Curious
rules.
as to why it was included. Perhaps there's a reason. There might be some specific rules within the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services that I'm not aware of. I mean, they have a
That
lot
the
of
city
rules.
attorney thought would be important,
Yes,
even though
I think
they're
there's a
not
reason why it
included
was
in the
included.
state emergency rules.
Yeah.
Yeah, we might just, when I mean, we're sending a recommendation, can't we send it as, you know,
Take a
the
look at
committee
this.
noted that the department names set forth in the ordinance may not be accurate? Is that
Okay.
too general?
Yeah. Plus, there might be more than one reference to that specific
Yeah.
department here. So if we recommend they change a specific line and we miss one somewhere else in the ordinance.
Well, in much the same way, we're intending to add some sort of editorial comment regarding social equity, which I don't presume we're ready to draft ordinance language, but the city attorney could certainly do that before commission sees it, or city council sees it.
And also Commissioner Boyle brought up that another ordinance has to be amended.
That's
We could put all of that in a transmittal
Also
letter.
true, yeah.
And as a note on Commissioner Wolf's comments, typically what the legislature does if they open up a section is they go through and they make all the necessary updates to department references and things like that. So it's just generally a good idea to review the language and make sure it's all accurate and up to date. But I'm sure they do that as well here.
Commissioner Wolf?
A question for Commissioner Williams. Did you have any suggestions for what could be done in this ordinance in regards to the social equity? You seem to think there might be something that could be done?
Not yet. I mean, I
Okay.
know, I did mention, if you look at the paragraph immediately above the one that was stricken by Commissioner Boyle's amendment, where it directs funds from the 1% of net profits or the $5,000 annual donation to a variety of charitable enterprises within the community. I think it would be helpful to think about ways in which social equity issues could be advanced by use of those funds. I know some communities, for example, have set up some funds to help residents have their records expunged. Issues like that could be at least considered.
A very good point.
Yeah, looking at it, it does, at least one of the clauses in there does relate to that, because it allows for things organized and operated exclusively for purposes of improving the lives of people with low to moderate income. Because one of the reasons for the social equity designation, or the, I forgot what they're calling us, 19 cities, but is
Right.
that they have higher than normal or higher than average poverty levels.
Right,
So-
as well as above average rates of marijuana arrests. So it's the dual.
Right. Well, it's not,
the
it doesn't
dual-
have to be both, though. It could be either.
No, it is both. It is both.
Oh, okay. I understood it could have been either.
In terms
the
of the
two.
19, the eligibility of the
Right.
19, it's both.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there is partially, so that's, I would certainly agree with that if that number 5 were rewritten, it's been copied exactly, again, from the medical marijuana language. And it would certainly seem appropriate to rewrite it for the retail establishment and change the designations of where that money would go. But
I think that would be
I'm
one
not sure we
step.
could do it
That would be-
tonight.
Oh, no, I don't think so. I don't think we should even try to do that.
Well, what is the language, the equity language in the bill itself?
I think the bill just requires the state to create a plan to assist communities that have been disproportionately affected by marijuana arrests. And the social equity program created by LARA that identified these 19 communities is that plan.
So if the statute said to address the equities, what is it?
The social equity?
Yeah, the social equities created by,
Disproportionate marijuana arrests.
so improving the lives of people with low to moderate income and addressing the disproportionate impact, what is it?
The fact that this community has been disproportionately affected by marijuana prohibition, I think, is the
Right.
language.
I mean, that could be inserted into it's paragraph 5.
Could be, but I don't know that we have, I don't think that we necessarily have an organization that's been organized and operated for that purpose. So I think this needs more thought and attention.
Sure. Commissioner Wolf.
Looking at the emergency regulations, I had not looked at this before. It actually
What
seems
section?
to say that, it's at the bottom of page 9, it says that the applicant for a license, for a marijuana, a recreational marijuana license, shall provide a social equity plan detailing a plan to promote and encourage participation in the marijuana industry by people from communities that have been disproportionately impacted by marijuana prohibition and enforcement. I don't know if I'm reading that wrong. It's talking about the applicant for a license. Sounds kind of crazy that way.
Sure.
I was thinking that a community would have to do it, but. And that's the only place in the emergency rules where the term equity appears. I just did a search through it, and
Okay, that's under the application procedure. So I wonder if that's trying to get them to hire people,
right, exactly.
participate in events for, contribute, yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's what that. And my understanding was that it was more of a state level program than a directive to local
Yes.
communities. Not to say that we couldn't mimic that here, sure.
Although, I mean, this is pretty specifically, I think, directing each of the applicants for a license to come up with a plan that presumably would be local to their area. All right, well, I guess we'll convey our
Yeah.
concerns about that to council.
Okay, then we are at the main motion with several recommendations about potential changes, or at least letting the city attorney know some concerns. I'm sorry, I'm returning to the one so that I know what I'm referring back to. 94A. Okay. All right, sorry.
And do we have included in that list that they need to revise the language about the separation distance to make it clear that it would cover both types of establishments? It's in part of the ordinance that's not in front of us tonight.
Exactly. That's one of the notes, is that,
Okay.
that I've made reference to 94A, parent B, parent 1, that Vice Chair Boyle had called out from the existing ordinance. It's not part of what we're looking at tonight, that would need to be, or that we would recommend that be cleaned up as well. And then the other two are that the departmental references mentioned by Commissioner Sullivan, and the social equity issues raised by Commissioner Williams.
Okay,
Those
but
are-
that
those are the
didn't
three.
cover the separation distance, did
I'm
it?
sorry, no, I was talking about the language is not immediately in front of us, so no.
The distance limitations, I think we need the recommendation that the ordinance be revised so that the distance limitations apply to both
Provisioning centers.
provisioning
and marijuana
centers
retailers.
and retailers.
So provisioning centers would still be separated by 1,000 feet or 500. And
All of them. all
No,
of them would
any
be.
marijuana.
Any mix of them.
Yes,
Yes.
any marijuana sales to customer establishment has to be at least whatever the distances we ended up with. And actually, the ordinance that I've got is not got the amendments to the 500 feet, so I'm not quite sure what the lettering is going to be of those sections. So,
Okay, so that item 4, recommendation item 4 then. Any other discussion on the main motion? All right, seeing none, we'll call for a vote. All those in favor of our motion with 1, 2, 3 amendments and 4, so say text recommendations, please signify by saying aye. Aye. And those opposed? That motion carries. Thank you. And that will move us on to item 8, new business. We have none listed. Is there any from the floor? Or commissioner concerns, item 9? I guess it's not less a concern, but more of a question. Are we not likely to see, because I had mentioned this as a concern last month, the Hub 2 project, and I had asked everybody to sort of think about if we want to see that before the ordinances, the East Village ordinance has even gone before council. They're moving that off to, I think you'd said November. Yeah, late November.
Oh, the
The changes to the East Village ordinance?
That's correct.
December 17th.
Yeah, let me see.
Oh.
Yes, so we're not, that's not even going to be, I guess I'm asking, is there any reason for this, for the commission to see that in its effectively non-final, final form before December 18th? In as much as the applicant would like.
development proposal?
Correct.
They would like to come back on the 23rd.
Is it 2 weeks from today?
Yep.
And do you know if it's their intention to get a recommendation from this body at that time?
That I don't know.
I mean, I don't know that
I don't remember if they were saying that they're coming back with the request for a recommendation at that point. I think think so. We did get back today, we got comments out of the Transportation Commission.
That's what's the,
Who have, I think they have 3 or 4 points for the applicant to address, and requested that that be done by the 16th. And that staff kind of bring in key staff level people from engineering, fire, and police and so on to address specific transportation concerns such as the alley, use of the alley and whatnot, and to kind of make sure that we all have our collective kind of unified message on those issues to the Transportation Commission, and then thusly back to the Planning Commission and or council at that point. So they have some concerns and some requests for more information.
And when do they meet next?
I don't
Before
know.
our next meeting?
I don't know the answer to that.
So you don't know if we would have that information?
Yeah. Which would ultimately determine what the Planning Commission could do.
sure.
Yeah.
I guess I'll reiterate my concern from last month or last 2 weeks ago then, and maybe this is, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but typically when we look at recommending approval of a petition, of an application to council pending a rezoning, which is effectively what this is, we would know, say that it's being rezoned from, name it, R30, RM32 to B2, and we'd know specifically what's permitted in RM32 and what's permitted in what did I just say? Whatever, B2.
B2.
The upzoning. And in this case, in as much as there's been, this body has made recommendations to council. The applicant has made different recommendations to council, and so we're at this point not really, if ultimately if the applicant's recommendations to council don't prevail, then presumably the project won't, in its current form, won't proceed. Again, I guess I'll leave it to each of you to search your consciences about how you feel about that, but if we see this in 2 weeks, would we feel comfortable with making a recommendation, not knowing ultimately what council's thoughts are about the changes the minor changes, but not, but important, I think, the changes that this commission did recommend to council. I'd be happy to listen to what you have to say now if you've got any thoughts, but.
Well, my thoughts are it's a more meaningful review if we know what the council is going to do about the zoning.
Yeah.
And if the sole purpose is to get it through the Planning Commission without regard to what the vote might be or the recommendation might be, in order to get it before City Council, then I guess we don't wait to see what City Council does with the zoning requests.
Correct.
But I don't think that honors the process, and I also think that time-consuming though it might be for the developer to work with the commission regarding the elements of their proposal, I think it's a worthwhile thing for them to do, and I don't see how we can do it until we know what council wants us to do with the zoning where these 2 buildings are going to be located. So I would certainly be in favor of waiting until council makes a determination on the zoning before we put further consideration into these buildings.
Mr. Cahill.
Or to the extent we haven't had a change from council, I think we have to evaluate it on the zoning that's in front of us, that exists at this time. I don't think we can speculate on zoning.
I suppose that's the other option, isn't it, right? That we're basically looking at it in terms of we know full well it doesn't comply. I would hesitate to call it a bit of the joke to review it at that point because it's so out of compliance with what the current zoning says. We know full well, I think, maybe we don't, ultimately what the recommendation would be, but in that case, then we wouldn't really get another opportunity to talk to the applicant if they're interested in listening about how modifications might be made to bring the the project closer to, if not within compliance with whatever ultimately what the zoning requirements are. Commissioner Cahill.
I was going to say it's really up to the applicant. I mean, the applicant can defer and wait for some action on changing the zoning. But if they insist on going forward, I think we're bound to follow the zoning as it exists today.
And I'm not concerned, I mean, in as much as it's time and effort, and it's not an insignificant amount of time and effort, I would submit that if an application of that far out of line with the zoning ordinance were submitted, it wouldn't pass staff's review, and we would probably not see it. I could be wrong. That at some point, staff would say, this is way out of what would generally be permitted. I don't mean to speak for you, but that, you're right, that if we were, somebody wanted to build a hog rendering plant right next to a daycare, staff would catch that pretty quickly, and that wouldn't get very far. We would see it and say the same thing, presumably. I guess it's not a decision that needs to be made tonight. I did want to make that sort of my concerns known and share that with you.
The applicant's well aware of what the problems are with the
Absolutely.
existing zoning.
Absolutely.
So it's the applicant's decision, really. Do they want to go ahead with the zoning as it exists today, or do they want to defer and hope for a change?
All right, fair enough. Thanks. Other thoughts? Commissioner Wolf?
I would not be looking forward to handling it, dealing with it before the changes. It puts us in a very awkward position. I would certainly feel as though I was obligated to consider it under the current rules, and as you've said, it departs in so many ways from them, the outcome is kind of obvious. And it means, in a sense, we're not really evaluating it exactly at that point.
No.
Well, I think my concern is that we're not assisting council
Right.
if we are hamstrung by the current zoning code, if in fact that may change in any way, that would make it a more doable project.
That's what I meant by we're not evaluating.
Yeah, we're not really
exactly.
helping council, and, maybe the developer doesn't care whether we approve it or not, or whether we split 50-50 on it or whatever, but, hopefully council thinks there's a role that planning plays in it, and it's pretty hard to play that role when we don't know, when there's pending zoning changes and we don't know what's going to happen with them.
Thank you all. Any other commissioner concerns? Then a motion to adjourn would be in order.
So move.
Second?
It's been moved by Commissioner Cahill and seconded by Commissioner Wolf. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. And those opposed. We are adjourned at 8.
Not quite.
Wow, 8, I'm going to go by the clock on the wall, 8:29.